Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Adam Lang. We talk to a lot of business leaders on this podcast. Leading a modern company is not an easy job. For instance, there's a greater focus on environmental, social and governance factors than ever before. Mostly it's known as ESG, and for some companies, this requires a significant shift in thinking. Then there's the challenge associated with a business as it grows, the changes to a company culture through acquisition or just scaling up. Dee Fitzgerald is the Executive Director at Russell Reynolds Associates, an organisation known for leadership advisory and executive search, but also assisting companies undergoing a merger or acquisition. Dee, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thank you, Adam. Lovely to be here.
Let's start with environmental, social and governance issues, better known as ESG. Do you see many leaders failing to keep up with the shift towards ESG issues?
What we've certainly seen in our Global Leader Monitor this year, Adam, is that ESG issues feature very heavily as a key risk amongst leaders in Australia.
So, directly in your business at Russell Reynolds Associates, how does this form part of your leadership recruitment?
Increasingly, it's becoming an important part of the leadership requirements. So, when you look at leaders who have a sustainable mindset, you're looking for the sort of leader who is able to look systemically at what's required for the future, who's got that long-range vision and who's got a much more inclusive approach to stakeholders, including their communities, government, etc.
So sustainability seems to me to underpin all of those environmental, social and governance issues. Are you finding that executive teams are more aware than boards because they're on the front line or on the ground? Or do you think between executive teams and boards, their mindset, their consciousness is basically on par with each other?
Adam, I think they're on par with each other. They're both thinking about sustainability as an important part of future-proofing the business. And, we've seen that recently as well with the emphasis on energy and climate change. And it's certainly one of the key issues that is seen as extremely important amongst Australian leaders this year. So it's certainly top of mind for both boards and exec teams.
Well, that's obviously good because they need to be aligned. There's a lot of work to get done. Do ESG factors ever take hold in a company at a grassroots level, so not just the executive and board, but at a grassroots level before it reaches the leadership? So we always talk about things filtering down from the top, but is it the case that sometimes it can go the other way around?
Absolutely. Leaders need to set the tone from the top around ESG, but the lived experience of people on the ground is extremely important. And we know that certainly next generation leaders are looking for organizations that have a much stronger sense of purpose and are much more inclusive. And, that's reflected as well within the communities and the consumers that organizations, people want to see that ESG is important. They want to see their leaders living the values around ESG. And if that's not their lived experience of the organization, we know, particularly with next-gen leaders, that they're much likely to go elsewhere.
Right. So given then that what you're saying is at the grassroots level, at executive and board level, are you seeing the pace of change with ESG requirements speeding up?
Certainly has over the past few years. And, we see that having a sustainable mindset is critical for leaders in the future. Leaders need to think differently. We know the requirements for leadership have changed, and in safeguarding the future, those companies that are thinking about sustainability are the ones who are most likely to survive.
That's really interesting. And in terms of measurement, how people measure the requirements for their company on environmental, social and governance, are you seeing that change too?
Certainly through the surveys that organizations hold, you see it featuring as a much more important factor, but also in relation to the UN guidelines and, people following those as part of their kind of governance processes.
Stay with me, Dee. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Dee Fitzgerald, Executive Director at Russell Reynolds Associates. So I mentioned earlier the growing pains a company might experience as it gets bigger. And so to what extent does a company's culture need to be reviewed as it goes, for example, a startup, a backroom operation, a garage or whatever, then a handful of people, to even having an office full of colleagues, or even businesses setting up in other markets and countries?
Yeah, absolutely. And as the business grows, culture tends to become diluted, and it's harder for leaders to really create the sort of culture they were able to in the early days. And we know that building a culture of innovation, inclusion, and agility is the best sort of formula for success. And once the business starts to get bigger, it's harder to keep that sense of agility, that sense of inclusion, that innovation going. So what do you need to do as a leader is to be really clear about what it takes to create a successful culture, and start to think about, what are the attributes that we really want to preserve as the business gets bigger. And, what does that mean in terms of what's distinctive about our culture, and how well do we understand that culture, and in what way is it getting out of alignment because of expansion, and how do we as leaders in a team need to change to build the right culture as the business grows. So really, it's a process of self-reflection, both individually as leaders and as a team. It's an opportunity to really pinpoint where the problems might be as you expand, move into new geographies, etc. What you can tend to find is that you have a number of subcultures, and that can seriously get in the way of creating the sort of culture that you want in the future. So being able to pinpoint where there might be particular problems, whether it's within an area, a function, a geography, early on, and take action is really critical.
That's so interesting. So I think what that speaks to is having to have a system of targets and discussion and articulating, environmental, social and governance, but also continuous review so that you keep involving people in it and how you're going to execute it. Is that right?
Absolutely. And what we do know is that standard surveys tend to paint an overly rosy picture of culture strengths and risks. They really tend to tap into how people are feeling at any point in time. And as a result, what you find is you miss some of the early warning signals. And when things go wrong, it's typically been a build-up over a period of time. And, if you haven't got a real sense of what's actually happening, if you haven't got that sort of rigor and accuracy around the data you collect, it can be really challenging to pinpoint where those problem areas or those hotspots might be.
So I imagine, without sort of divulging any names or particular situations, where have you seen this work really badly? Because that can often expose the why, the stick in why we need to do things. And where have you seen it happen really well? The aspiration of how we can be better.
Yeah, well, when you look at culture change, it's not a quick fix. It's something that sort of takes probably about 5 or so years to create. So it's not a once and done. It's something you need to work hard at. And the first thing is kind of creating the conditions for people to actually really respond honestly and share how they're feeling about the organization's culture. And we know there's often a disconnect between the tone that leaders are setting from the top and the lived experiences of people on the ground. And what you really want to try and create is an alignment between the two. So really getting to unpack where the issues are, particularly around things like safety, ethical behavior, commitment to diversity, all of those things, that organizations are trying to focus on to create an environment where people feel happy to speak up. We know in response to surveys that people tend to respond in a way that they feel will please their bosses. And often the bosses' bonuses, etc., are linked to the results of surveys.
Right.
So it's really hard to get some honest truths from the surveys that people conduct year on year.
And your work at Russell Reynolds is obviously specialist in this. And what do you see happen during or after an acquisition? What impact can that have on a company's culture?
Well, you often find that it's the the last thing on people's minds, and you see a clash of cultures, and it's something that continues for a period of time. You often hear people many years later associate themselves with the organization they've come from. So really needs to be a very proactive approach, starting with the leaders at the top and working on what's the leadership tone we want to set for the new organization. What do we want to keep in terms of the attributes from each of the organizations? Have we got the right capability to be able to do that? So looking at leadership capability and culture hand in glove.
And making those part of your processes ongoing, right? Because basically this is good work. You're trying to become more sustainable all the time to keep the company healthy. So I imagine it just, as you said earlier, it has to be part of your ongoing process.
Yeah. Well, in M&A, we do a lot of due diligence around the business, but we do very little due diligence around the people and the culture, and being really thoughtful and deliberate around, what sort of capabilities and what sort of culture the new organization is going to need. And then working towards that aim, towards that goal is really important, both in terms of the selection of the new leaders to run the combined organization and the cultural tone that group of leaders set from the top.
Dee, are you finding at Russell Reynolds Associates that environmental, social and governance work, this work we're talking about now, has that been an expanding part of your business?
It has been an expanding part of our business, and we've seen it expand in two different ways, where organizations are looking for an individual who can take the lead in that domain, someone who brings in that expertise, who operates at a really senior level in a chief sustainability officer capacity and works hand in glove with the CEO and the board in driving that strategy. We've also seen it more broadly as organizations seek to support all of their leaders to build a more sustainable mindset. And that's where it really becomes part and parcel of the cultural fabric of the organization.
Dee, thank you very much for talking to Fear and Greed.
You're very welcome.
That was Dee Fitzgerald, Executive Director at Russell Reynolds Associates. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Remember, you should get professional advice before making any investment decisions, and join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Adam Lang. Enjoy your day.